I've been so excited for our next keynote. When we were talking about bringing her over to keynote, Liz brought me about 20 or so exciting talk ideas, equally interesting and relevant to the industry right now. Sometimes the hardest part of my job is when all the ideas are good and I have to be the one to choose it. Lis Moberly is the creative lead of 20th Century Games at the Walt Disney Company. She has worked with companies such as Obsidian Entertainment, Warner Brothers Avalanche, and Chuhai Labs as a game writer and narrative designer. Her work can be found in Avowed, Curse to Golf, Hogwarts Legacy, and We Went Back, among others. In addition to her game work, Liz is a former academic and professor who continues to study critical issues facing game development, including game dev burnout, feedback culture, and institutional memory. The institutional memory stood out as such an important conversation to be having right now. With constantly shifting teams, longer dev cycles, and less opportunity to learn directly from seniors, the industry is facing a difficult challenge. Here to help us unpack it, please welcome to the stage Lis Moberly.
Okay, let me see here. I need to log in. One moment. Good morning. It's good to see you all, to meet many of you. It's also really, I've never been to Australia before, and there's something so great about game dev that you can go anywhere in the world. You've never been there before, but you still have close friends there. And that is just the most amazing feeling to me. So I do want to shout out my friends Samara and Tim Stobo and Beck. I'm so glad to be able to come to you this time. So it is ready. How do I get it up there? Okay, I will present that. Okay, so let's get started. The title of the talk today is Unsaved Progress Will Be Lost, with a too long title, Why the Game Industry Forgot How to Make Video Games and How to Fix It. Now, I think that I oversold this a little bit when I made this title. I am not a prophet or a soothsayer, and obviously a lot of this is based off my subjective perspective. However, I hope that it starts a conversation about where our industry is right now, where it's going, and what are the action items we can take that are tangible within our grasp in order to be able to make it better. So a little bit about me. I got started in the industry when I was actually 17, too young. I was a week out of high school, and I got an internship at an anime voice dubbing studio, and we transitioned into game development. And so I basically was an audio designer for many years. And then that's me around that age. I'm actually 19 there, but I couldn't find a picture of me at 17 because who wants to look at those? And basically, I did my stint in dev. I did the whole thing. This is in the early 2000s when this was happening. And one day I woke up and I'm like, wow, I'm really burned out and I've crunched a lot and I'm tired and I want to go to college. So I decided to do that thing, and I ended up doing a lot of college and university. I loved it, and I genuinely thought that I had left game dev behind. But joke's on me. While I was in graduate school, and also I later became a professor at a university called Utah Valley University, these were my topics and focuses of research, essentially: memory and adaptation theory, early modern literature and philosophy, rhetoric in particular, political rhetoric in specific, and of course creative writing, because I'm a writer, right? But as I was teaching in Utah, basically the siren song of game development came back against all my better impulses. I really missed making games with people. And I had some people that I knew at Warner Brothers, and they had a location in Salt Lake, and they said, hey, would you like to do this thing? And I was like, I can do that over the summer because I'm still teaching full-time. Joke's on me. I ended up quitting my teaching job and going back full-time to game development. So here, that's where we are. And this is why all of these things that I learned in my academic career are informing the talk today. So first of all, I think all of us over the last couple of years are like, what the hell is going on? Like, and I don't just mean in our industry. We have the genocide in Gaza, we have Ukraine, we have fascism and authoritarianism spreading across the world. Violence against immigrants or hatred against immigrants or people of color, our marginalized communities, our queer communities, our trans communities, but also climate change. This is a lot for us to take in. I think all of us have probably stressed about one or more of these elements in our lives. But on an industry level, obviously, we're all dealing with layoffs and studio closures. And even if you are not hit, it is so demoralizing to have to watch it, right? It is really difficult to watch your friends and peers and an industry that you love seem to crater in real time. And and it's not just the layoffs, right? There's a funding drought. Games are taking too long to make. Social media landscape is terrible. And, I'm regularly seeing GoFundMes and LinkedIn campaigns now, please for help financially from our friends and from our colleagues, and they're just trying to survive. Games journalism, which is necessary for the health of our game industry, has been gutted. And burnout is prevalent everywhere. Tim Stobo and I did a lot of work on burnout, and so we talked to countless developers about their experiences here, and it's getting worse. There's also no way to break in, it feels like, whether you're a new indie team or you're a junior or you're making a transition out of another career into this career in game development, it feels impenetrable. And obviously we have a lot of speculative tech trends that are happening right now, particularly generative AI adoption. And there's this brain drain, like we're losing people because of all of these things. And on top of everything else, the question that I have also returned to, which doesn't seem as important as all of these others, but I think we do have to address in order to help ourselves get out of it, is why are so many projects across so many studios such a damn mess, right? It seems like we are constantly hearing about projects that failed or struggled and people got hurt or they're seemed with storied studios, right? Like these are not just new teams, these are old veterans who are really struggling to even pull their teams together when they do have funding and they do have staff. So I think that begs to mind is like, how did games used to roll, essentially? I mean, I was not there when the world was born, but I've been around for a while, and this is my memory of when I first started in game dev. There were a lot of physical storefronts, 1 to 3 year dev cycles. Games were made in-house, teams were much smaller, there was a flatter hierarchy, everyone was in their 20s or 30s, more diverse tools in tech, in my opinion, and there were a lot of dudes. Traditional print media and advertising was essentially the name of the game. There was way less professionalism, and I feel like that's being really generous in that description. There was ubiquitous crunch culture, and we were viewed as making toys. I also didn't put this bullet in here, but also there was a lot of, how to put it, people thought that we were making people violent, right? And I feel like those attitudes, at least those last two, have really done a 180 in the time that I've been in development. These pictures up here are from dev teams that made some of our favorite games, and they look so different than many of the teams we have today. We have the original Fallout team, we have the original Naughty Dog crew, their full team, by the way, in that picture. We have the original Half-Life team, and we also have the original Tomb Raider team. These are how big these teams were. And I think when we look at this, that feels so impossible compared to what it takes to make a game today. And so here's what games today are struggling with. There's a lack of leadership, there's a lack of vision, no pre-pro, or also bad, eternal pre-pro, a lot of mid-project reboots, missing milestones and launch dates are common practice now, and there's a lot of turf wars inside of a project, even small indie projects. Production is often run amok. I'm not blaming producers here, by the way. I'm saying that production gets run amok. Many designers are lacking foundational skills that once used to be a given. There are bloated budgets, churn, you're just doing the same thing over and over and over and remaking stuff, but it's not actually iteration, you're just like making it a different bad way. All-star teams are cratering, there's always that one asshole, and the game may still be mid, right? And all of that leads to burnout, and that to me is like, I feel like all of us have faced this existential dread at some point in our career, or if you're in school, like while you were in school, right? So some friends that I have, I asked them how they're feeling about this. You know, we're in Discord servers chatting, and one of my friends said, I've been in games 20 years, and shipping used to be normal, fast. Now in every project, I'm surprised if it ships at all. Another friend said, it wasn't always like this. We used to know how to do this. And this leads to the conclusion that a friend said, and I have heard repeated since in the last 2 years, it feels like the industry forgot how to make video games. So the question we have to ask is, did we forget how to make video games? Or has it always been this way? I turned to Reddit. This post was written 12 years ago. 2013, and the question is, why is there so little institutional knowledge in this industry? And the conversation was between a group of developers, and they were developers, you could tell by the way they talked. And I'm not going to read this whole thing in full, but there are some parts of it that I do want to read to you that sound hauntingly familiar. So much of what is done in games has been done a dozen times, at least well, once, so why do these teams seem so oblivious as to what has proven to work well or fail horribly when it comes to common features and fundamental mechanics? The starting point of these teams with these initiatives always seems to be complete ignorance of anything, really harsh, that has ever been done before in their industry, and the discussions often read like someone introducing cavemen to fire, also harsh. Also probably a little overblown, that's fine. But the thing that was interesting to me was this comment, but this seems to happen even with teams producing sequels to games that were made by their own company. Even where there are no apparent obstacles to ripping off their own earlier work, teams seem over and over to be either unable or unwilling to learn from their past mistake and successes, and they proceed to happily make the same spectacular missteps all over again. At this point, there ought to be a lot more senior people in this business who have been there and done that, who recognize that there are usually one or two ways to solve a design problem that will work well and about a million ways that will fail horribly, and who can tell the difference. This sounds a lot like people I know who are really jaded and mad about these sorts of questions. One of the responses to this post was by another developer who said, I've worked in the video game industry for close to 10 years. I'm in my mid-30s. Many of my former and current colleagues who are of the same age or older are almost all jaded by the game industry and want to move on for various reasons. I highlighted the reasons that this developer gave. One, it's too nomadic of an industry. It's a really high-stress job, understatement of the century. And then three, they feel like even with all of their experience, they have to compete against juniors. I think that, in particular, has really changed. I feel like juniors now can't even get into our industry in a reasonable manner. And I've been seeing many of my friends and colleagues get burned out. So I feel like, yes, it has always been this way, but I also feel like the problem has exacerbated. We don't want to do this. We don't want to keep doing this. This is bad. So we need to remember what worked and what didn't. So part 2 of the talk, memory fundamentals. Welcome to class. So it would not be a Lis moment if we did not talk to the OED, okay? The Oxford English Dictionary. Memory are senses relating to the action or process of commemorating, recollecting, or remembering. But more importantly, memory is identity, and it gives our life context. It allows us to process the present so we can look forward to the future. And that is the key. Without memory, we cease to not understand ourselves. We can't understand who we are without our memories. Many of us have loved ones, or we have witnessed Alzheimer's or dementia impact members of our own family, mine included. And oftentimes these people don't, when it gets really progressive, it's really hard to remember who they are. They are lost, and it's a very scary situation, right? Memory allows us to orient ourselves into our own reality. More importantly, though, is memory is actually a form of metaphorical thinking. We don't tend to think of it this way, but we think of our lives in metaphors. And, for example, love is war, life is a journey, right? Those are things that we say, and we create metaphors for how we understand concepts in the world, but we also do so for our memories. And the way that we translate our memories is informed by metaphor. Now, memory studies has actually quite a long history at this point. There are lots of different types of memory that are being studied in research and in academia: post-memory, memorialization, historical, collective, public, social memory, prosthetic memory, nostalgia, commemoration, artificial memory, cultural memory, yeah, the list goes on, okay? But we're talking about institutional memory, and what is that? It's the collective knowledge, wisdom, best practices, methods, techniques, and philosophy, both technical and cultural, that is contained within an institution's people, okay? So, just to highlight, it's not recorded. Institutional knowledge, let me give you a couple of examples. After work, let's say you had a really bad review of a milestone, right? Like, you were writing a quest and it bombed, and the director got really irrationally upset, and you're like, I don't even know what I did. And one of your colleagues who's been at the studio for 15 years pulls you aside and is like, you want to get a drink after work? And you're like, yeah, definitely, right? And you sit down, and that colleague begins to explain to you why that director was so triggered. They share a story about how something went really, really wrong on a project and how people lost their jobs as a result of a really bad decision made. And you could have never known that on your own, but this developer was able to inform you of that. That's a prime example of institutional memory. It's the knowledge at work that lives within people that is really hard to record. So, we also have to ask the question, how do we forget in an institution? Well, constant restructuring is one. Every single time you restructure a company, a team, a project, whether it's a reboot or whatever else, acquisition, you are going to lose a lot of knowledge because something's always going to get lost in the shuffle, right? But not only that, you've now remixed teams, you've put people who haven't worked together into the same group, and now they have to learn all over again how everyone vibes together, right? What's their methodology? Obviously, mass layoffs or closures do not help if the people who hold the institutional memory are not there on the team or in the building. It's kind of really hard to get their perspective. But also a change of storage sites. I can't count how many studios are like, we're going to move from Jira to Airtable. We're going to move from Box to SharePoint. We're going to move from Slack to Teams. All of this, every single time you move storage or communication sites, you are going to lose knowledge as an institution. That doesn't mean you shouldn't do it, but it means you do need to be very deliberate. Studio hopping. I gotta say that I think it's become a lot more common for people to switch teams mid-project. It's not uncommon for someone to come to a team, indie, AA, or otherwise, and be like, I'm here for 2 years, and then I'm gone because I got a better opportunity. No shade, I've done it. But what that does, it makes it really hard to, even within the scale of one project, to have pipeline memory, to have workflow memory, to have cultural memory. Quickly following trends, remember NFTs? That sort of thing, right? Trends, doesn't help. And it's the attitude that the past is irrelevant. This is actually used to be a much bigger problem in games, where people were like, you know what, we're the innovators. We don't do what the others do. We break with the past. We're always looking forward. That attitude can actually get you in a lot of trouble if you just are persistently existing in ignorance as to what worked or did not work in the past. Insistence on ceaseless innovation, I also covered that. NDAs, controversial, maybe. I feel like people on the ground get it. I feel like our companies don't get it. But generally speaking, NDAs do have a place, right? We're trying to protect our product. We're trying to make sure that they come out in the way that we can define for ourselves. But it has really reduced the ability to knowledge share as an industry, like not just as a company from company or team to team, like as a body of people. Our expertise and our technique is limited by what we can or cannot share about our tools, about the mistakes we made, about our successes. And I feel like it's really also frustrating for people who are trying to learn in the industry to try to adopt to this, right? Like, how are you supposed to learn how to be a narrative designer, a combat designer, a systems designer? How are you supposed to learn how to do certain types of art if you're not allowed to look at how that is done or not able to be told how that is done until you get the job, right? Also, no occasions given to remember. So what are the consequences? Retrying failed solutions, adopting fashionable but untested solutions, copying others, thus abandoning your strengths, ignoring knowledge of long-term staff, and inconsistency in user relationships, aka with your players. We have seen studios where they didn't prioritize their institutional knowledge long-term. All of a sudden their games start to fall short because they have lost what made their games their games. There's this perception that it's the tech that makes the game or the unique kind of design philosophy, but it's the people who have a certain type of practice that make the games what they are. And if those relationships are lost because they're no longer there or that memory is not accessed, then it will damage your relationship with your players. So how can we remember? Part 3, using memory, a primer. So all of these are what we would call metaphors for what memory is. And what you will find is over the course of history, people defined what the mind, the brain, and memory is using different metaphors. And why does this matter? It matters because the way we think of what the mind and memory is shapes our constraints and our boundaries to be able to break out of that thinking, right? We become defined by the metaphors we use. So for example, in the top left-hand corner here, you see a wax tablet. That was the metaphor that Plato used for what memory is like. He's like, memory is like a wax tablet. You write in the tablet and then you clear the wax, right? And it disappears. You have to conscientiously write on the tablet, but it will never stay. Socrates said that memory was like an aviary. Others said it was like a book. Giordano Bruno said it was like astrology and the constellations of the stars. Henry James said it was like the ocean and stream of consciousness. And Sigmund Freud is the one who, he's everywhere. Sigmund Freud said the mind is like a house. You can access certain rooms, but certain doors stay shut, and certain rooms are used all the time, and others are never visited. And others said that the memory is like a dictionary. In our modern age, technology has very much informed how we think about the mind and what memory is. When trains were at their peak, people were like, the mind is like a train. It just carts things from one place to another at high speed, right? Getting from one location to another, and you have to put down the rail in order to be able to access the memory. But then telephone switchboards became like the hot thing. And so everyone said memory and the mind is like a television or a telephone switchboard, right? And then today, the one that has dominated for basically the last 25 years is the mind and memory is like a computer with a server and downloads, everything. And those are the analogies we are currently working with. So how do we first use this memory, knowing that these metaphors are important? First, storytelling. I edited this slide yesterday. I was in Samara Jade's panel yesterday, or talk, and she said stories are how we remember. She was quoting Robert McKee, but I like Samara better, so now it's by Samara Jade. It also inserts emotion into plot, right? Storytelling and memories are important because of the emotion that they elicit, right? It's much easier to remember something if we have some sort of associated emotion. We also can incorporate storytelling into our feedback. Oftentimes we don't do this. We say, here's the critique, here's my feedback, but we never sit down and say, here's how I came to that feedback based off this experience and this story. If you're having trouble with someone who's not taking feedback, oftentimes framing it next to stories actually makes it much more memorable, and by research says it's much more likely to be adopted. We also have to be patient with ourselves. We're going to fill gaps. So the mind will try to fill in gaps where the memory just isn't there. It'll just make up shit, you know? So it will try to absolve itself. Like, if you did something really shitty to somebody, it's going to be like, no, you didn't. And so you have to be very conscientious about exactly what that memory, you recontextualizing that memory. You want to be conscious that this also happens to institutions, right? No one wants culpability. So you need to be flexible versus embracing false memory, and false memory is a very real thing. But we also have to embrace new meaning. Be willing to amend your narratives, especially with new information, but also understand that over time, memory was always meant to be moldable and flexible. Memory cannot be one-to-one replicated. In the same way that when you make a video game remake, it's not going to be a one-to-one faithful adaptation. You don't have the same tech, you don't have the same engineers, you don't have maybe some of the same assets, maybe you don't even have some of the same VO. It is an adaptation of that thing, but it is not the exact thing. You will never be able to do so. You also have to recover context. In order to properly gain meaning out of a memory, you have to be aware of the context in which the memory originally existed and the context in which you currently sit, and that changes the memory. So, for example, when I was a kid, I remember the first time I lied to my mom. I'm not going to go into it, but it was about an omelet, okay? And when that happened, at the time, I was devastated because she caught my lie and grounded me for 2 weeks, and I was very sad. Now I laugh because I was so dumb in how I tried to cover up I'm not eating the omelet. And we laugh about it now, but it certainly wasn't a laughing matter to me then. You need to acknowledge that new context and embrace conflicting narratives. Oftentimes, our impulse in an institution is to say, hey, I want to, this is what happened. This is the real story. This is the real me. And that sort of thing actually is not helpful because, for example, if you make a piece of content, right, or I don't like calling it content, but if you make something in a game, chances are other people also touched that thing, right? And their experience of having worked on that thing may be a little bit different than yours and may not be the full story. For example, I worked on a companion character in a game, and I worked on that companion character, I think, for 2 years. And I was the primary writer, but there were 8 other writers that contributed to that companion by the time the game shipped. That is not to say also the designers who implemented it and made decisions about timing. That's not to say the artists who, concepted the character, and the animators who made the character really, truly come to life, right? All of these people have their own points of view about the development of this character, and I only have, even though I was basically the holder of that character, it does not make me the ultimate authority on that character. A really good example here, David Lynch, we love you. In his movie Lost Highway, there's this really telling exchange where Bill Pullman, who's playing Fred Madison, he's in an interrogation for a pretty serious crime, and he basically tells them, I like to remember things my own way, not necessarily the way they happened. This is actually pretty close to how memory actually works. So now, naturally, we have to talk about my grandma's cookies. So this is my grandma on my dad's side. She's cute. Love her, Pina, okay? And Pina's cookies, there's a bloodbath every time there's a family get-together about these cookies. You have 25 rabid people trying to take the cookies, right? And these are my mother's cookies, Brenda, okay? Brenda's cookies. They are not the same type of cookie. Now, I have tried to replicate my grandmother's cookie and my mother's cookie and have been I've written down the recipes, and they never come out exactly like theirs. But I have started to make my own cookie, combining the best I know of my mother's cookie and my grandmother's cookie, and as a result, I have what is essentially a Moberly cookie, right? It is passed down from the best of what they have both taught me. But I also have learned that unless you have the exact ingredients from the same source, unless you are doing the exact same measurements, if you don't have the same type of oven temp, or even the sheet that they cool on and how long it takes them to cool, the cookies turn out different, right? And a lot of those variables I can't control. And that is similar to how institutional memory works within game development. So another example of this is Henry V. The original Henry V was filmed in 1944 towards the end of World War II with Laurence Olivier as the title character. And it was meant to be a morale booster, and so they featured really bright sets. They edited all the stuff that made England look awful out. So a little bit of revisionist history there. And then we have the version from 1989. I say 1984 because Branagh actually did a play version of this that was almost a one-to-one adaptation that he later made into the film. And both were in commentaries about war. Kenneth Branagh was very much concerned about the Falklands War that had just happened. But you'll notice the tonal difference between the two. Branagh intentionally invoked Olivier's set, right? He's on a wagon, he's surrounded by people, but the mood could not be more different, right? And that is very similar to how when we are trying to adapt memories from the past from our developers, we have to expect that the adaptation is going to be different than the original instance. Frankenstein's the hot thing right now. It's October. And Guillermo del Toro is like lighting it up, right? Frankenstein is really interesting in adaptation theory, and I think that it actually has relevance to game development. Why? Because if you look at the top 3 images here, these are 3 different classic movies of Frankenstein. You probably recognize a couple of them at least. And the high point of the movie is always when the creature awakens. It's alive, right? And that is always the part that audiences are the most eager. How does Dr. Frankenstein make the creature? How does it happen, right? And it's just a moment of great drama. Now, I'm not going to read Mary Shelley's original writing of this moment, but it is so unremarkable. It's incredible. Like, basically, she says, I promise myself both of these when my creation should be complete. Basically, Dr. Frankenstein is complaining that he's tired. And he's saying, yeah, this really sucks, and I really want to get back to exercising and sleeping and having fun, but I got to make this game right here with this corpse, right? So essentially, what happens is like, you just flip the page, and all Shelley says is, it was a dreary night of November that I beheld the accomplishment of my toils. Ta-da, done, right? There is no true description of like exactly how Dr. Frankenstein in the book did the thing. We fill in the gaps of how that works, right? And so oftentimes in game development, when we don't have institutional knowledge, we will fill in the gaps and sometimes create a completely different expectation of a story or of development that was not there before. So something else that we can also do is something called intentional sharing. You want to create the occasion, make access easy, and it does not have to be related to an intentional need. So what I mean by this is you need to get people together on purpose to share stories and to share memories. If that does not happen, then institutional memory will not work within your institution. There has to be time set aside for the telling of stories and for the exchange of memory. So a really good example of that is GCAP has roundtables, right? Roundtables at different conferences are really interesting because they're almost always centered on telling stories that give perspective about the question or topic that's present at the roundtable, right? It's an opportunity for story share, it's an opportunity for perspective share, and we have to have that intentional moment in order to be able to do so. Now, a note on documentation, because oftentimes when I talk to people about institutional memory, especially in game development, they're like, oh yeah, we got a bunch of Confluence pages, it's great. Said no one ever. So institutional information, that's what it is. It's actually not institutional memory, it's called institutional information. That's the formal term for it. And it struggles with context, and it's why most postmortems go ignored. Essentially, documentation is a resource to access memory, but it is not the memory itself. Unless you create the occasion to look at that documentation or to look at those resources, then all of that effort is essentially wasted, which is pretty depressing, but also go look at your Confluence pages. Okay. Repetition is also important. You need to repeat stories over and over. Research shows that if you repeat a story up to 6 times, then you will gain full retention of the lesson or the principle of that story. That is the sort of thing that's a lot of repetitions of a story. Some of us get really annoyed when you hear a friend share the same story over and over. You should thank them, they're trying to teach you a lesson. You also have to emphasize importance, right? And it creates new interpretations and possibility for interpretation, and it reflects value and purpose, and it allows for learning to occur. There's also spatial memory. This one's a little bit harder in game development, especially in our current world. We need to return to significant team or project locations. This is actually really powerful. Like if you return to your hometown after years away, you're gonna be like, wow, that changed and that changed. Oh, the library is still there. And that's where I went, like mini golfing with my friends in high school and this, and there's that spatial awareness, and being in a space is an automatic trigger for memory. With games, I feel like this has become harder to do, but if there is an opportunity for your team to do that, it's incredibly powerful. It can also have a massive impact on memory. So hang up accomplishments, history, and key moments, whether in your homes if you work remote, or in your offices if you are all together. You want to do this for the team, but you also want to do this as an individual. If someone has like a box of their first game that they ever worked on hanging in their office, chances are someone at some point coming into their office is going to ask about, oh, did you work on Legacy of Kain? Really? Tell me about that, right? So they're going to tell you a story of what that was like and something that they probably learned, right? So next up are artifacts, which are a little similar, like the Legacy of Kain example I just used. You want to put them in display in common areas, emblems, symbols, and keepsakes. This is not merchant swag, nope. Backpack's not going to do it. Heirlooms of the institution, and when you use those things, you will be better enabled to be able to make a connection to memory. People have huge attachment to things. This is why kids love their plushies. Right? So now there's a dark side of memory. We can adopt the wrong lessons, both as developers and as an industry, if we are not careful. When we use memory to justify harm, avoid responsibility, ignore objective fact, and we empathize, like instead of empathy, using memory to empathize with another person, we use it as our own over-identification of our own pain to justify causing pain to another person. Or when we oversimplify memory, right? Like we reduce it down to something that actually misses the original context. We also see weaponized forgetting. Sometimes this is gaslighting, sometimes it actually takes other forms. These are not proper uses of memory, so please don't get them confused. Now, I'm gonna get into the actual hot takes of what I feel about game development right now, what we have forgotten and what we need to remember. So please remember that these are my personal observations and opinions. I actually really love when people are like, you know what, Liz, I don't agree with you. I always want something to be a conversation, and I hope that 5 years from now we have better information so that half of this is null and void and some of it ended up bearing true. But if we don't have the conversation about it, then it's really, really hard to move forward, okay? So first, smaller teams. I keep hearing this all the time. Games are too big. And I don't disagree, but I actually think that the issue is that our teams are too big. Smaller teams with doable budgets, creative autonomy, and solid tools are always going to get more done than a bloated team. And that's because there are less variables to think about. Less hierarchy. I really do believe that management bloat, even on small, scrappy projects, is killing us in this industry. It doesn't mean that we don't have management at all. It means we need competent, thorough management, but you can overdo it, essentially, to where the creatives now, their job is to manage management instead of actually making the game. We also need smaller dev cycles. Seeing a full dev cycle is, in my personal opinion, essential, and I am concerned about the number of developers that we have now who are in positions of leadership who have never seen a project from beginning to end. I don't blame them for this, by the way. Like, there are structural and systemic reasons that this is happening, but it is hurting games in a major way. Devs should go through them repeatedly. It reduces project fatigue the shorter these projects last, and less time in burnout loops. Like, when Tim and I studied burnout, it was very clear to us that if you're burned out, the thing you need to do is get out of the loop that's happening that's causing your burnout. Well, you can't do that if the project just keeps going on forever and ever and ever, right? You need it to end. It also helps refine pipelines and workflows and encourages more focused games. We also need to think about foundation versus decor. A developer that I talked to several years ago, his name is Chip, and he worked at Valve. And I said, Chip, if there's one piece of advice you could give me, what would it be? And he said, Lis, make sure that when you're interviewing with a new team, if they have a build, to play it. And I said, sure, yeah, of course. And he's like, no. He's like, if the foundation of a game is bad, then there's nothing that can be done. No amount of iteration, no amount of fixes is going to fix that game, and that team is going to end up in crunch, they're going to end up in bloat, they're going to end up with extended deadlines, they're going to end up with a bunch of burnout, because every single change they make is only surface level, but the existing problem is still there, and there's nothing they can do about it. When you have smaller dev cycles, it is harder to run into these problems and allow them to persist long term. It increases nimbleness as well, and our ability to basically have our reaction time and our minds be a little bit more creative in coming up with solutions. I also want to talk about production sanity. Good producers are essential. I would go into oncoming traffic for a couple I've worked with over the years who just absolutely saved my ass, right? On projects where I thought I was losing it. But their responsibility is for time, resources, and removing blockers. And then we need our production staff, and I want to add here, I've been a producer at one point, and I have such strong feelings about it, but we need our production staffs to be more curious rather than reactionary. When something happens, ask questions, ask why it happened that way. Ask why this problem is occurring. Be really curious about your teams, and therefore it will give you more information instead of having an immediate panic, because when you panic, the rest of the team will panic. The best producers, in my opinion, have served in other disciplines, but that does not mean great producers cannot come from having only studied production, but it certainly helps. There's nothing I'm a narrative designer, there's nothing like having a producer who's been a narrative designer helping us with our pipelines, right? I also want to talk about what I call production pseudoscience, which is kind of strong language. I feel like all of us, including producers, have been subject to other producers who insist that Kanban is the way, who insist that Agile and Waterfall has to be done, and that their Excel sheet cannot be tampered with, right? That, to me, is production pseudoscience. It's not that those methodologies are not useful or do not work, but you have to think about the type of team you have and the type of game you are making. And insisting on a methodology that does not fit your team is only going to hurt them and delay production, which is the antithesis of what your job purpose is for. Production gates exist, but a standardized production process does not. Each game is very, very different. We also need a lot less hierarchy. Again, I think hierarchy is killing us in games. I do admit that this is addressed to what I think are much bigger teams. Title chasing, also choking us. I think that there's definitely a sense that in our industry it's hard to survive. So therefore, we want to have some level of legitimacy. If you're a junior, like, I just got to get to mid, right? If I'm a mid-level, when I just make senior, or when I finally become a lead, or when I finally become a director, and that golden goose just keeps getting put in front of you. But it shouldn't be about the title, but there's a reason why we chase the title, and it's because it's tied to our pay, and it's tied to our autonomy, right? So there are more external dependencies, and those mean also less flexibility. These are all forms of hierarchy on a project. Publishers, licensors, hi Disney, outsourcing, code dev, marketing, right? All of these things make it harder for a team to adjust and move when decisions or changes need to be made. And that can make things really, really difficult. I also want to talk about personality in our tools. Licensed engines and tools are everywhere now. Issues, they're a pain in the ass. I mean proprietary tools, by the way, not licensed tools. Sorry, Unreal, if you're here. They're expensive, there's a lot of risk, and devs just don't want to use proprietary tools because a lot of us have like PTSD from trying to get an engine that is really janky to work and that no one else knows how to use. But there was something about proprietary tools that was essential, which is they defined the personality of our projects and of our studios. And some of that, I do believe, is being lost as a result. In order to inject that personality back into whether you're using Unreal or Energy, Unity, it takes a lot of investment, it takes a lot of time and patience in order to customize those tools in order to be able to achieve that. So it's still a pain in the ass, and it's still expensive, but it's also necessary. We also need something that I would call responsible autonomy. When Tim and I were working on burnout, one of the main causes of burnout is a lack of autonomy that devs feel when they're on their projects. So it's a powerful motivator for developers, and it reduces rivalry, and I'm going to talk about rivalry in a second. It prevents bad management and prevents burnout, and it preserves human dignity. It is natural as a human being to want to have control over your own circumstances and your own path, especially when you are a creative. And it's really hard because we are dependent on a bunch of other people, unless you're a solo dev. Shout out to the speaker yesterday, I loved your talk. I think that unless you are in that situation, your dependencies, like you are connected to everyone around you and they are dependent on you. But it is a very natural thing to want control, right? But you have to be very conscious of how you channel that. So I believe in autonomy with respect. Respect to the game vision, to your peers on the team, to your leaders, and to yourself. Because you can take wanting control so far that you lose sight of your own goals in the process. So how do we do this? We need to default to autonomy. This is for leaders in this room. If you're leads or directors or maybe even game directors, we need to default to allowing autonomy for our devs. We need to be available to our staff. We need to check in with them regularly, not as a form of micromanagement, but as a form of support. But we do have to telegraph consequences if autonomy is abused and someone just goes rogue, right? We should have regular reviews and understand that mistakes will happen. That's okay, that's normal. You cannot learn if people do not make mistakes. But we should make those mistakes and those misuses of autonomy a teaching opportunity instead of immediately defaulting to punishing people, right? I'm going to talk about the department fallacy. I promise I'm almost done. Bigger projects equal more departments, okay? I've been on a number of indie teams over the years, and even on indie teams, sometimes people get really possessive about their discipline or about the department that, like, I am the writer, right? I am the artiste. I'm the producer, right? And so what I say goes, right, in this department. And there is some truth to that because they have expertise. But it does discourage direct communication with others if we become so siloed and entrenched in our own disciplines that we cannot see the affordances of the others. Interdisciplinary groups produce the best work. The best experience I ever had on a AAA game was when, it's actually kind of sad, but like when I got hired as a writer on one game, there were 10 other writers in this writer room. Can you imagine? It was so big. And they're like, we don't have room for you. So we're gonna put you downstairs in the VFX bucket. And there were 8 other VFX artists in that bucket, and I had a blast. These dudes, the Great 8, I call them, they just like gave each other shit all day, but in a loving way. They had worked with each other for 10 years. Every single one of them had worked together for 10 years. And I learned so much from them, but they, for the first time, were able to ask writers questions about what was going on in the game. They had never really been informed. And so I ended up becoming so much more knowledgeable about projects because of them, right? And so when a spot opened up in the writers' bucket upstairs, I was like, no thanks. And that made people upset because they thought I didn't like them. But that was not true. You also want to consider where people sit. I think I just made that position clear. I actually think that it's really beneficial for departments if they're not all seated together in one spot. Like, I understand the desire, but I think you get a lot by not doing that. And leaders, meet your staff where they are sitting instead of forcing them to come to you. Hiring juniors. Okay. I know that this is huge on Blue Sky discourse, so I'm not going to try to repeat the stuff we know, which is we need to be fair, yes, but that's actually not my point. Juniors have enthusiasm, but more importantly, if you want institutional knowledge in your dev studio, then you need to be hiring juniors. And here's why. They're the future leaders of the studio. If those juniors stay for the entirety of their career at that place, at that studio, then they will have a well of institutional knowledge by the time they occupy that role. That is incredibly valuable, but that is really difficult if you just hire a game director completely from the outside who has no experience with your institution, right? They also don't live in the land of no. It's very easy as an older developer to be like, no, that does not work. Trust me. It also embraces the team's philosophy and best practices. They really can be molded to that because that's their first experience, right? They also, in my opinion, drive the social engine and energy of a studio. They want to be there. And that matters so much. It's very easy in kind of the worst stages of production when things are getting really hard and everyone is tired. Oh, my timer says it's up, 1 sec. To lose that. So I will abandon this, Sav. I will not stress you out, okay? But a clear primer here. What do we need to forget? Controlling behaviors. Formalizing every pod or strike team is a kiss of death. If you are too rigid on how people need to operate, they will eventually rebel. And let people hop disciplines and try new skills. It's actually been distressing to me to see how many teams are cracking down on people that are like, this is your role, and I need you to do this role, and they punish people who are trying to do something else, like a level designer who wants to become a writer, or a writer who's like, actually, maybe I would make a better producer, right? We need people to grow and to change, but most notably, I did a talk with my friend Alexa Ray Correa a couple years ago, and we noticed this trend when we surveyed something I think it was 25 game directors. We noticed that the ones whose staff said that they loved that person as a game director had worked in more than 3 disciplines throughout their career. So it actually becomes vital to being able to run a project home. Let devs go and come back. If you want to see what the superpower is, if a dev has worked at a studio and they kind of have a sabbatical at another studio, when they come back, they still have the institutional memory of the original studio, but they've also learned stuff, and then they bring it back. And that, I think, so pay attention to the devs who want to come back to your teams. Documentation dungeons, I already talked about this, but like stop documenting, start building, lean on documents. Also, documentations don't have to be documents. Like, they can be audio files, they can be videos. I was a professor, and my students loved when I left a voice note instead of like inline comments on their essay. And they were much more likely to edit their essay because of that note. Stories over documents. Documents are for the team, not for you. I'm going to note this. I have 2 slides, and then I'm done. I'm stressed. Okay, so rivalry. I really want to address this one because I don't feel like it's talked about in our industry enough, and this is less about institutional knowledge, even though it does relate to it. In a lot of studies on institutional knowledge, they say that one of the biggest killers of institutional knowledge is rivalry. And unfortunately, I feel like I see it in the game industry everywhere. It's anti-collaboration. Teams without rivalry share and assist their peers more, creating better games. Rivalry will divide studios, departments, teams, and projects, and it's a desire for control and survival. I'm not saying that rivalry doesn't occur for reasons that are understandable, but if you start detecting this happening on your teams, you really need to address it. It's often motivated by fear and often creates a false sense of unfairness for both parties. One more note about rivalry. The thing about rivalry that is so insidious is that when I say that I see it in the industry, for example, I was on a team where I would say 70% of the team were contractors and 30% of the team were full-time employees with salaries, and in America, that's tied to healthcare benefits, right? Dumb. But essentially, everyone knew that for every 5 contractors at the studio, they would probably only be able to keep 1 at the end of the project, and the other 4 would be let loose, right? It created an intense amount of possessiveness and rivalry among the contractors at that studio who desperately wanted to have a full-time position so that they could have health care, a very reasonable desire, right? And America. But those are the sorts of things where when you look at that, all of a sudden the contractors, instead of being peers who were supposed to be working on the same game together, they became competitors, trying to say, no, I am not going to let you cut that, even though it was the best thing for the game, because I need to show that something important ended up in the game. I've also seen it among juniors who are unwilling to let things go because they're like, well, if this game ships and I have nothing to show, how am I supposed to get my next job, right? I've also seen it happen amongst the indie community and also in the AAA community. When someone gets funding or success and you feel like it wasn't earned because you worked much harder and it seemed like it came so much easier to them, sometimes that can create a lot of jealousy and resentment, right? Those are the sorts of things that we have to be very, very careful of. And it doesn't help our teams, and it doesn't help ourselves. This note about new all-star teams, I have to say it. There's a lot of, in the wake of all the layoffs, we are seeing a lot of teams being formed by veteran devs who are like, we're the best of the best, right? And we're all going to come together, having never worked together before, to make the best game of the year, whatever. I have seen it repeatedly. A new team is a higher risk than new tech, a reboot, or switching genres. That's a pretty bold claim, but I believe it, and a lot of them are failing right now. So if you're going to create a new game team and you want to prioritize institutional memory, you have to start small. Start with as few people as you possibly can and scale very slowly. Adding 20 people to a 30-person team within the course of a month is not it, okay? Work with the team you got, and if new skills need to be gained, understand the reasonable quality threshold and keep teams together after the project ships. Conclusion, without memory, we will keep making the same mistakes and succumb to the same failures. Memory lives within people, not within documents, not within repositories. And we need to know what to remember and what to forget if the industry is going to move forward. Thank you.